Good afternoon. Thank you for accommodating the delay. We have a working quorum, and the chair recognizes Steve King for his First Amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the amendment I offer is numbered 180.
Amendment to H.R. 1071 offered by Mr. King of Iowa. Page 2, line 4, strike V and insert subject to the section 6, V. Page 6, line 8, before the secretary, insert and subject to section 6 of this act.
I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered.
Mr. Chairman, I
as
reserve a
read.
point of order. I haven't seen the amendment yet.
I don't
Point
have
of
it
order
either.
is reserved by gentleman from Virginia. Mr. King is recognized in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is a very simple amendment, and I appreciate the gentleman's reservation, and it's appropriate. What it does is it recognizes that the information that we have with regard to the immediate family members of the unlawfully present 9/11 victims, the largest number that we have, we're assured, is no more than 19. And so what I'm seeking to do here is offer an amendment that simply limits the expansiveness that's potential in the nature of this bill and inherent in the nature of this bill by simply putting a hard cap on it, add 1, take it to a round number ending in a 0 above that 19 that I'm assured it's no more of. And that's as simple as the amendment is. I haven't had a serious discussion on the other side of the aisle with regard to this, so I would not be entirely surprised if there was an issue or two, but it's offered in the spirit of simply staying within the boundaries that have been proposed by the proponents of the bill. And with that, I would urge adoption and yield to the ranking member.
Is the gentleman's time expired?
No, his time has not expired.
I thank the ranking member for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I would only say that I do support this amendment, and I want to recall the words. If the subcommittee chair is going to accept it, I won't go any further, but I just do want to recall her words from earlier today that I think her word was that the class of individuals not only would not exceed 19, but I think she explained why it could not go up in the future. So I think this would be an amendment that would enable us to err on the side of caution in one sense, make it 20, but it would also enable us to lock in what we've all stated publicly. Thank you, and I'll yield back.
And I would yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do not support the amendment, but I am certainly willing to consider talking with the gentleman between here and the floor further should this amendment be defeated. The amendment seeks to limit the number of potential beneficiaries under Section 3 to 20 people. The amendment seeks to limit an already limited class. We actually took the time to get the final report of the Special Master for the September 11th Victim Compensation Fund of 2001, in which we have provided to the minority. And on page 30, the Special Master states, and I quote, "The fund received eligible claims from families of 11 deceased victims confirmed to be undocumented aliens. The benefits under the bill before us only accrue to spouses and children granted claims under the VCF. And since the VCF, or Victims Compensation Fund, is now closed, there is no potential to increase the class of potential beneficiaries. It is per se limited. There's no need to limit the class here. It is limited. It's limited by reference to the claims granted under the VCF. Since all the victims are dead, they will not be having additional children, and if they did, those children would be U.S. citizens born in the U.S. So the class is limited already, and the representation we have is that it's 20s. That's really, we know it was only 11 victims, this amendment, I believe, is unnecessary, and I would therefore oppose it, while noting that we would certainly continue to talk. As Mr. King has noticed, we've not had a discussion on this amendment, and I would offer to sit down with the ranking member and to further discuss this amendment if it is defeated.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I would be happy to yield.
I'd thank the gentlelady, and I regret that we haven't had that sit-down discussion. I look forward to that, and I don't mean to imply anything here. This process has been accelerated unexpectedly, and so the time that we thought we had between now and September to have these conversations closed up within about a day on us. So that's what brings about these kind of amendments. But I would be. Everyone who has proposed this has given us a number no less than 19 or no more than 19, and so I would think this would be the least controversial of amendments I might offer. And I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, I believe that is the case based on the representation of the volunteer lawyer who has represented the families of the victims. But as we've discussed earlier, this is not a private bill, it's a public bill, and it is about a class of people that is limited and can never grow bigger than it is today. We do know from the special master in his report on page 30 that at the time that the funds were adjudicated under the Victims' Compensation Fund, there were only 11 deceased victims. And I would yield to Mr. Watt.
I just wanted to inquire of the gentleman who's offered the amendment, if it turned out to be 21 as opposed to 20 or 19, how the gentleman would propose to deal with that extra one. What would I mean? It seems to me that this would be a counterproductive amendment because then you'd have to have a separate private bill to deal with the one child that might have been, you know, and if the bill itself already limits it to a discrete class of people, I'm not sure how you would, under those circumstances, deal with that if it turned out to be 21.
Okay. If the gentleman would yield?
Well,
and a lady would yield?
I would be happy to yield to the gentleman.
Then I would submit that I believe the gentleman from North Carolina actually supports my point that I made earlier, which is that even though the identity of the individuals that are the subject of this bill, I recognize why they would not be revealed to this committee for fear of law enforcement. But by the same token, the characterization of the individuals, I believe we should see, because this is the equivalent of a private bill, even though it does go to a class of people, and it's a very limited number, and I have not, and perhaps that information is available to me within the last few hours, but I have not evaluated this, and there are many questions that I haven't had an opportunity to get answered, and so I think the gentleman actually supports my point. They assured me it's only 19. I added one. How many might be added that we would not know about is the reason for this amendment, and I yield back.
And I yield back to the chairman and thank him for recognizing me.
The question occurs on the King Amendment. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed indicate by saying no. 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 The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
The amendment is defeated. Yes, sir.
I'd ask for a recorded vote, please.
Recorded vote is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Conyers?
No.
Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Berman? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Watt? No. Mr. Watt votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
No.
Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Waters?
No.
Ms. Waters votes no. Mr. Delahunt? Mr. Delahunt votes no. Mr. Wexler? Mr. Wexler votes no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes no.
No.
Mr. Cohen?
Tell us.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Ms. Sutton? Mr. Gutierrez? Mr. Gutierrez votes no. Mr. Sherman? Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Mr. Ellison? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Coble? Mr. Coble votes aye. Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Goodlatte? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Lundgren? Mr. Lundgren votes aye. Mr. Cannon? Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Pence? Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Feeney? Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes aye.
Are there any other members that choose to vote? Mr. Berman?
No.
Mr. Berman votes no.
Are there any other members that have not voted? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 17 members voted no, 11 members voted aye.
The amendment fails, and the chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk designated as number 182.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1071, offered by Mr. King of Iowa, page 6, line 19, strike and. Page 6, line 22, strike the period at the end and insert.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
I'd like to reserve a point of order until I read
Reserve
it.
a point of order is made by.
And I withdraw the point of order.
All right. The gentleman from Iowa is recognized in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would help ensure that the will of the proponents of this bill is implemented. The proponents claim that these people should get amnesty because they were in the United States on September 10th, 2001, and have become rooted here and should not be forced to go back to their home country. But nothing in this bill prevents someone who was outside the United States on September 11th and who has not spent even a single day in this country from becoming a lawful permanent resident under this bill. My amendment would require that in order to be eligible for lawful permanent residence, a person must demonstrate that they were in the United States prior to the tragedy on September 11th and that they have continuously remained in this country since then. Proponents of the bill have provided only the smallest bits of information about the people who would be eligible for relief, and much of it was not specific to any particular beneficiary. That was originated from unknown sources and was accompanied by the disclaimer that has not been updated or verified. A September 3rd, 2006 New York Times article reports that details are sketchy about the 11 families who are survivors of illegal immigrants and who receive funds under the September 11th Victims' Compensation Fund. The article states that at least 3 lived abroad at the time of the attack and remain there. Those people have no roots in this country. I've not heard any report that they've been targeted for extortion or crime in their home countries now that they've received compensation under the fund in amounts which, according to the article, range between $875,000 and $4.1 million. The current bill does not require that the beneficiaries have been here prior to September 10th or that they have any ties to our country. My amendment would prevent lawful permanent resident status from being granted to survivors of 9/11 victims who were in their native countries on that date and who have remained out of the United States and who have demonstrated no compelling reason why they should not disrupt their lives to come to the United States, or why they should now disrupt their lives to come to the United States. If we are to give amnesty to illegal immigrants under this bill, it should only be to those who meet the requirements claimed by the supporters of the bill, people who were in the United States before 9/11 and afterwards, and who have adopted the United States as their home. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Again, it's consistent with the position taken by the proponents of the bill and just simply seeks to qualify that into the adoption of this amendment. I urge adoption, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Arthur Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try not to take the 5 minutes because I know the chair wants to move these votes through, but I want to use Mr. King's amendment to make a statement about this bill and also in opposition to his amendment. What I think is interesting and what is so profoundly evil about the September 11th attacks, Mr. Chairman, is that they had a very simple predicate. The instigators of the attacks believe that if you were a part of the American enterprise and if you were living the American experience, they had a grievance against you. It didn't matter if you were another Muslim. It didn't matter your race. It didn't matter, for that matter, whether or not you even had some political sympathy for some of the causes even indirectly connected with Al-Qaeda. And it's interesting that we have opposition now to this bill on the theory that, well, some of the people who were in the towers were American citizens. Some of them had relatives who were American citizens. Some didn't. Some were documented. Some were undocumented. Al-Qaeda did not draw that distinction in any way, shape, or form. And frankly, there's something unbecoming about this committee or members of the committee trying to draw a distinction based on someone's citizenship status. The people who were killed that day were not given an opportunity to pick a side or to express a preference in any of the issues associated with Al-Qaeda and radical Islamic fundamentalism. So I think the amendment should be voted down, and I think that, frankly, the opposition to this bill is not well taken.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
And I thank the gentleman from Alabama and point out that, that my amendment speaks to the actual presence of the individuals who are beneficiaries of this bill as having been reported to not ever having been in the United States.
Well, reclaiming my time, a survivorship benefit.
Well,
reclaiming my time, a survivorship benefit. The key inquiry is the decedent, not so much the legal status of the survivor.
I agree.
That's a fairly basic proposition of law. So, however you wish to frame it, you, in effect, are making a statement about the lack of citizenship or the lack of legal status of the individuals who are the decedents. Because I presume you will oppose the bill. And again, my comments are not just about this amendment. It's about your opposition to the bill, too. And I think that it's, frankly, wrong for the committee to draw or to delineate between these individuals based on their legal status when the people who perpetrated the attack would not do that.
If the gentleman would yield.
Oh, yep.
And I would submit that the lawful permanent residents of the individuals or the legal status of the individuals that are subjects of this bill are the subject of the bill, and the debate about whether they were or not legal status is irrelevant to this discussion. We're talking about whether or not the subjects of this bill, we recognize that they're illegal if they're in the United States. That's the subject of the bill. So we're talking about whether they were ever in the United States and if they were here on September 10th and continuously here since September 10th.
Well, reclaiming my time, I thought I made it clear my observation was in opposition to your amendment was a broad statement about the bill. We should not delineate or leave these individuals in a disfavored status based on the legal status of the decedent. That is the opposite of the lesson that we should have learned from 9/11. And frankly, when I go back home to my district and I talk about the lessons of 9/11, one of the things that I point to is that our enemies don't draw distinctions between us. They don't draw distinctions between people who are living the American experience. They lump us all in the same category, and they have an animus toward all of us. They don't give a special pass based on someone's ideology or religion or nationality or status. So why should we?
If the gentleman would yield.
Mr. Chairman.
If I have time.
And I would just like to quickly acknowledge, I do now understand your point, and obviously I disagree with that. I just had trouble understanding it because it's a long ways away from mine. I'd yield back.
The chair recognizes Mr. Smith.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly, I support this amendment for the reasons that the gentleman from Iowa stated. And if the gentleman from Iowa would like any more time, I'd be happy to yield. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield to the gentleman from Iowa.
I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding, and I would just like to follow up with this: is that, you know, we have looked into this thing as closely as we can with what access we have to information, and I expect that we will see more information between the committee and the floor, and hopefully that those answers will be easier to achieve than they have been in this accelerated time that we've had to bring this bill to before this committee.
Would the gentleman yield?
Who asked me? I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman from New York.
I was just curious. Could the author of this amendment provide any information about his whereabouts every day since September 10, 2001?
I'm not the subject of the bill, but I would tell you exactly where I was on September 11th, if that's the curiosity of the gentleman from New York.
Is not where the presence of on September 11th isn't the question. It's your physical presence in the United States for a continuous period beginning on September 10, 2001 and ending on the date at which the alien applies for relief under the section. The question that I'm posing is, technically, you've made a great deal of inquiries about someone's criminal background and now their location for a period of years. I'm puzzled as what evidence you would accept from someone as sustaining this impossible to sustain thing, which is a presence in a certain place for a period of time, every day, day in and day out.
Let me reclaim my
years
time.
And years and years.
And before I yield to the gentleman from Iowa, say that it's my understanding that the amendment does clarify that one does not have to indicate their presence every day, and in fact allows for possible absence from the country. But I think, I'm not yet, but I think that there is an answer that the gentleman from Iowa will be happy to yield to him.
And I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding, and I would speak to the definition of continuous presence, and that is it allows for absence of no more than 90 days at any one time, or 180 days in the aggregate. That's the definition of continuous presence. And in response to the question asked by the gentleman from New York, yes, I could demonstrate and prove my presence here in the United States continuously without any difficulty. And I would think most of us, if not all of us in this room, could do the same. And so I don't think this is an unreasonable request. It seeks to allow for a bill that can reward the people that are the subject and the intent of the proponents of the bill, and not broaden it to people who maybe have never set foot in the United States or who left the United States and don't have a tie to the United States. I think it's consistent with the intent and the spirit of the bill, and I would urge the adoption of this amendment. I yield back to the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman?
And I'll yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Berman.
Well, my question was, and who has the burden of proof? Mr. Wiener's point, I believe, was, how does one establish that every single day that he was present in the United States? If you're saying it is the INS or ICE or whoever's burden, but I think Mr. Wiener's point is worth
I'll
answering.
reclaim my time. It seems to me that while you don't require an individual to be able to know where he or she was every day, any normal individual would certainly be able to know whether they were out of the country for 90 days or not. But I'll yield to the gentleman from Iowa.
I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I would submit that the way one proves that is the same way we do under current law. This is, I referenced the definition under current law. This definition of continuous presence is consistent, not unusual, and I don't think it's an unfair burden to put upon people that want to have a green card and a path to citizenship in the United States. So I yield back, gentleman from Texas.
Okay, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, is recognized. And the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, is seeking recognition. If you have any extra time, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would the gentleman from Iowa yield?
I would yield.
Do you have some definition that says continuous period does not disallow somebody who might have gone for a weekend to Nassau and came back? Is there some law that says continuous period means you can go to Canada for a couple of days, you can go to Vancouver, you can go to Birmingham, and that's still continuous?
That would not exempt them from access.
Where's the law?
Pardon me?
Do you have law that shows that?
There is immigration law that addresses current law that says continuous presence in the United States, and they might show leases, they might show bills, they might show economic activity or physical presence, but it has to be provided by the person
How would you yield to the lady
that is
from
applying for
California?
lawful permanent residence in the United States.
I can reclaim my time and yield to the lady from California, because what this says, I believe, is physically present.
If I thank the gentleman for yielding. In immigration law, continuous presence is, in fact, as mentioned by the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, defined as departure for a period in excess of 90 days or an aggregate exceeding 180 days, and brief, innocent departures would not break for continuous presence. The point I would make, however, and I would like to say, and again, and I'm not calling complaints or anything else, we have not had an opportunity to sit down and discuss this amendment. I will promise to do so between now and the floor if this amendment is not approved. But I think the issue here is, as Mr. Davis indicated, this is an additional evidentiary burden that I think is inconsistent with the efforts of the bill to assist people who have been victimized by the 9/11 disaster, who want to be able to pray at the site of the World Trade Towers because that's all they've got by way of a burial site. And that's really what the thrust of this bill is about, and why I cannot support the amendment today, but I pledge I will sit down and see if there is some, common ground. I don't know if, I can't promise there will be, but I would certainly promise to explore that and see if we do reach common ground. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you, and I thank you for clarifying that point on the law. Just on just a general point, and I guess it's the whole substance of why the bill was brought. These are extraordinary circumstances. This was the most horrific attack on the United States in history, and the attack was within eyeshot of the Statue of Liberty, which we pride ourselves on saying, give us your tired, your huddled masses, give us the children and the relatives of the people who were burnt, died jumping out of the towers because they didn't want to burn, were disintegrated in this horrific experience. I can't believe that we're even having this discussion on these technicalities when we've got a situation that is so unique that we should think about the Statue of Liberty and what this country is about.
Would the gentleman yield before he yields back?
I yield back to the gentleman from New York.
I would just echo what the gentleman says, and I also want to encourage my colleagues, even those that are in opposition to this, to be a little cautious and sensitive to the language that is used. A couple of times I've heard in the discussion of this about the wealth of the people who are left behind. The gentleman from Iowa just described the reward that we're giving with this legislation. We should be sensitive to the idea that nothing that this committee does, as glorious as citizenship is, as many dollars as the Victims' Compensation Fund is we distributing, none of these people are benefiting in any way. These are people that lost spouses, these are people who lost husbands, these are people that lost wives, these are children that are growing up parentless. This notion that somehow we're dealing with a universe of people who are going to come out better as a result of this, I want to just put my colleagues at ease that that is not going to happen. And finally, this notion that how many are there? Well, those of us who live in New York know that on a daily basis, the number has changed because, as the gentlelady from California has pointed out, it is not as if you can go to a morgue and look at people's toe tags and see. We are learning day by day. We recently had to close down the West Side Highway because it was discovered that in manhole covers there were human remains in the year 2007 that had not been discovered and not been identified. Every single day there are families whose guts are wrenched by these events, and all we're trying to do here is say to this—
Gentleman's time has expired. You can finish your thoughts here.
Is to say to this class, and it's a small class, we don't know the exact number perhaps, to say to this class that we understand, and to say something else, that we in Congress, when we contemplated the Victims' Compensation Fund, we thought through these things and decided we were going to treat all victims and their families the same. This is a group of people that slipped through that crack, and we're just trying to patch it up. So I would just urge my colleagues to keep in mind the macro view, the 30,000-foot view of what it is we're trying to do here.
Thank you. Mr. I have a request from Dan Lundgren.
Thank you, Mr.
And Mike Pence, and we recognize Dan Lundgren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would like to support this bill, and that's why I asked for additional information, and I received some of that information, but it is incomplete. And I understand now the chairman has promised that between now and the time this bill is on the floor, we will get more complete information. But what bothers me a bit is that amendments by Mr. King that basically go to putting in the bill the assertions of fact that were made to us upon our inquiry are somehow considered inappropriate, offensive, and in various ways they do not belong in this bill. I would just mention that, at least according to a recent newspaper article, there have been more than 500 private immigration bills introduced in the Congress since 1996, yet of those more than 500, no more than 36 private immigration bills have passed into law. I've heard this said this is not a private bill. The gentlelady from New York, Mrs. Maloney, has actually described it as a private bill, even though technically it is not. And when we've looked at private bills, we have understood that they are exceptional circumstances that require us to change what otherwise is law, and that's what we are doing here. The idea that offered by one of the members of the other side that somehow by adopting Mr. King's amendment, we are ignoring Al-Qaeda's challenge to us actually misstates what Al-Qaeda said. Al-Qaeda has said in their own documents that it is their intent to kill Americans anywhere in the world, either in the United States or otherwise.
Would the gentleman yield?
Not at this time. Man, woman, or child. The second point I would make is that there were others killed in the attack of 9/11 who were not American citizens, who are not beneficiaries of this bill, and I use that in the technical sense, or they're survivors who were beneficiaries of the bill in this sense of being granted citizenship. They're nationals of other countries. They suffered every much as anybody else did, but we are not passing a bill saying that everyone who died as a result of 9/11 is therefore granted, or their close relatives, American citizenship. We are doing this in a case where we are saying these are individuals who died who are in this country illegally, but for equitable reasons, we are going to confer this benefit of citizenship, and I do believe that is a benefit to them. In response to that, some of us have merely asked, can we have the information? And when Mr. King says, at least we ought to have information that there is proof that there is continuous residence here, because that shows a commitment to this country, we are told that somehow that is unfair to do that, and it requires them to prove something that is unprovable, yet that is the normal state of immigration law that is handled every single day by what was used to be the Immigration Service, and now its successor. And so it is making it difficult for those of us who would like to support this. And then I keep hearing this idea that somehow those who either oppose the bill or want to have some amendments have in some way depreciated the value of the debate by talking about the money involved. In the material I received from Mrs. Maloney, or from the attorney through Mrs. Maloney, it specifically states in there one of the reasons for support of the bill is that these family members received financial settlements from the fund as a result of their family members being killed in this attack, and that they would therefore be subject to the possibility of physical danger if they were returned to their country, because they would be seen in their home country as people of wealth. That's how this was brought up in the first place, and it continues in the documents that I've been given in support of this bill. So I just wish we'd lower the rhetoric a little bit about some who might oppose the bill or want to have some amendments as being their language being cruel or in some way insensitive, when the whole question that was brought up was one of support of the bill. That was the guts of the argument as to why these individuals ought to be treated differently than other family members of victims of this terrible tragedy who are non-Americans in those Twin Towers on that day.
The gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the King Amendment. All those. I beg your pardon?
I think you recognize that Mr. Pence would be next, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pence, you're recognized.
I move to strike the last word.
Without Objection. The gentleman is recognized.
I thank you. I especially thank the gentleman from California for his greater vigilance than mine. I won't take all of my time. I would just associate myself with Mr. Lundgren's remarks that I thought were, even for him, especially eloquent. Meaning he usually is pretty eloquent. I would like to support this bill. And I talked to Ms. Maloney personally on the floor about it. I am grieved to this day about what I saw when I traveled with some members of this committee up to the site of the World Trade Centers 10 days after they came down. I have supported legislation to assist the community, to support the Victims' Compensation Fund. But I can't help but feel that this bill is not ripe at this time. I have a great regard for the gentleman from Alabama, but I would say I think what they hate about us is that we're a government of laws and not of men. They live by the sword, by the point of a gun, and by violence. We live by the rule of law, and it is about the law that we are deliberating here. I will support Mr. King's amendment because we don't have the information necessary for me not to support an amendment like this. That's what pains me. And I would just observe that all of this goes away if we know who we're talking about right now. I've talked to Ms. Maloney about it. I've talked to some members of the majority about this issue. Mr. Weiner just made the comment, and I say this with great sensitivity because he lived this tragedy in ways that I did not. But he said in his words moments ago, where on a daily basis the number has changed. Well, I'd be satisfied to know who it is now. It's my understanding, Mr. Chairman, that the truth is that the legal counsel for the people whose status we would be changing will not permit this committee at this time to have their names. And I'm troubled by that. As to the assertion Mr. Weiner made that these individuals, quote, slipped through the cracks, I'm prepared to be corrected, but I believe the reason we are considering changing their status is because they certainly did not slip through the cracks of the Victims' Compensation Fund. They have received, justifiably in my judgment, millions of dollars of American taxpayer resources to offset their extraordinary and unthinkable loss.
Yes. Mr. Chairman.
You know, it does seem to me, I can't help but feel that this bill is not ripe. I grieve with these families. I am prepared to support this quasi-private bill if we could know who it is that we are attempting to bring this relief to. I'd be pleased to yield.
The gentleman has been thoughtful on this question and seems particularly pained to try to come up with a resolution. Might you get some comfort by the fact that we can attest to the fact that most of these have been in place since 1996, that they can document for you the place of their birth or origin, Central or Latin America, one born in West Africa. You can document where their families worked. I think what I would say in response to the lack of the knowledge of all of the names, these people too are in fear of whatever governmental process may place them in jeopardy of having to be deported. They're trying to get private relief because they've exhausted all administrative relief.
Reclaiming my time, if I may, I think that the profile of victims whose families would be eligible under this act does include, though, a disclaimer at the bottom which says, quote, it has not been updated or verified for purposes of this submission and in certain cases derives from information received from others. I appreciate the tone and content of the gentlelady's remarks, but I just would renew my concern that as strongly as I want to support this bill, I can't help but feel that this committee owes to know who it is.
Would the gentleman yield on that
extending relief to? I'd be pleased to yield.
I just want to make sure the gentleman understands, notwithstanding any characterizations to the contrary, this is a public bill. no different than other public bills that we very often say these are the characteristics that people that are being described, but we don't know every person, we don't know with their schedule for the last several years. I mean, this is a public bill. This is not a private bill, so it's not a knowable, finite universe. All we can do is do what we do in every other effort when we have a bill, which is do our best we can to calculate the same way when we do a tax bill and we have an estimate of the number of people that would be affected.
I thank the gentleman.
I
appreciate the clarification.
Would the gentleman yield, Mr.
I would
Pence?
yield my
Gentleman, time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent that the gentleman be given 30 seconds.
Absolutely.
I'd be happy to yield.
I just want to say, I think sometimes in the committee we talk past each other. We don't mean to, but we do. And I'm getting that sense now. And I'm not faulting anybody. I'm sensing that. And I just want the gentleman to know, and all the members on that side, that I'm going to do my very best to get every piece of information that the members want. And I make that as, you know, I don't have a magic wand, but that is my personal pledge to each of you. And I just wanted to say that, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
That's helpful. I yield back. I thank the gentlelady. I thank you, Chairman.
You're welcome. The chair recognizes Jerry Nadler of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think this bill is not ripe. I think this bill is about 6 years overdue. And with all due respect, we know all we need to know. We know more than we need to know, and I'm at a loss for whatever. I'm at a loss to know what other information may be necessary. We know that there were 11 people who were undocumented aliens who were killed at the World Trade Center. We are told that their beneficiaries are 19. Maybe it's 18, maybe it's 20. The point is, it's a closed universe. Every single one of those people, we can't discover any new ones. Every single one of the people who could be beneficiaries of this bill has already been adjudicated and gotten an award from the Victims' Compensation Fund. That fund is closed. The only relevant facts we need to know are that these people were victimized by the terrorists who attacked the United States, and that that some of them are children who are U.S. citizens because they were born here. Some of them are not, and they will be deported, and they will never be able to visit the only gravesite we have, because these people were vaporized, of their loved ones. Frankly, I don't know what else we need to know. We certainly don't need to know their names. We need to know the characteristics, and the only relevant characteristics are that their husband or wife or father or mother was killed by an attack on the United States, and that they need relief against the danger.
Would the gentleman yield?
One moment. Against being deported. The World Trade Center is a final resting place of all the victims of the 9/11 attacks. This bill would allow the spouses and children to remain near their loved ones. It would be tragic, I think, to impose additional burdensome proof obligations on them after all they've been through, and there's no purpose to it. It's not as if there are hundreds or thousands or even tens of people out there that we don't know about. The bill says that if any one of these people has a criminal background or anything, they're not eligible. So we don't need to know whether they have a criminal background, because if they do, they're not beneficiaries of the bill. So I think we know everything we need to know. I think this is, frankly, everything else is just carping, and I don't understand the reason for it. The only relevant facts are that they were victimized as targets of terror of the enemies of the United States, and we ought not to be cruel to their surviving family members who number less than 20. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time, and the question is on the amendment. All in favor will signify by saying aye, please. All those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
And a roll call is requested.
Okay.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Conyers?
No.
Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Berman? Mr. Boucher? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes no. Mr. Watt? Mr. Watt votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes no. Ms. Waters? Ms. Waters votes no. Mr. Delahunt? Mr. Delahunt votes no. Mr. Wexler? Mr. Wexler votes no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Ms. Sutton? Mr. Gutierrez? Mr. Gutierrez votes no. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman votes no. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes no. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Ellison? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Coble? Mr. Coble votes aye. Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Gallagly votes aye. Mr. Gutlatt? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes aye. Mr. Lundgren? Mr. Lundgren votes aye. Mr. Cannon? Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Pence? Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Feeney? Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes aye. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes aye.
Are there other members that have not voted? Mr. Berman.
Mr. Berman votes no.
Other members? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members voted aye, 20 members voted nay.
The amendment fails. A reporting quorum being present.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I ask
Mr. Lundgren.
Strike the requisite number of words.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to vote aye on this bill on passage, but if we do not get the information that is sufficient to sustain my support on the floor, I will vote against it on the floor and urge others to vote against it as well. I'm voting aye to get this bill out of committee based on the representation that efforts will be made to give us sufficient information. But if that information is not forthcoming, I will not be able to support this bill. I think my friend from Iowa has offered some reasonable amendments that do nothing to destroy the integrity of the bill or in any way contradict the intent of the bill or the substance of the bill as explained by its proponents, both in this committee and to me personally. And that's why it's troublesome to me that there was such a concerted effort to make sure that those amendments not be adopted. But based on the representations that we will have sufficient information to sustain support of the bill as it has been explained, I will vote for it now. But I will tell you, it is a serious issue, and I hope this is not a partisan issue because the two co-sponsors are not partisan, and there is a real effort to try and help people that I think need to be helped. But there's also a concern on the part of members on this side of the aisle, and I think on members on your side of the aisle, that we do this in the proper way and that we at the same time uphold the rule of law in ways that make sense and are transparent. And with that, I would yield back.
Would the gentleman yield for a brief?
Happy to yield back. I'd be happy to yield the gentleman.
I just want to, again, pledge my best efforts to get as much information as possible. I would ask that the gentleman and others who have an interest in further information list there with some specificity precisely what they want to know, not here at this moment, so that we can work off a common document and then do our level best to get the information. I thank the gentleman.
I will endeavor to do that, and I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman and the gentlelady. The question is on reporting the bill favorably to the House. All those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed by saying no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
And the request for a recorded vote is made, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Conyers?
Aye.
Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Berman? Mr. Berman votes aye. Mr. Boucher? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott votes aye. Mr. Watt? Mr. Watt votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Ms. Jackson-Lee votes aye. Ms. Waters? Ms. Waters votes aye. Mr. Delahunt? Mr. Wexler? Mr. Wexler votes aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Ms. Sutton? Mr. Gutierrez? Mr. Gutierrez votes aye. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman votes aye. Ms. Baldwin? Ms. Baldwin votes aye. Mr. Weiner? Mr. Weiner votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Davis? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Ms. Wasserman-Schultz votes aye. Mr. Ellison? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Coble? Mr. Coble votes no. Mr. Gallagly? Mr. Gallagly votes no. Mr. Goodlatte? Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Lundgren? Mr. Lundgren votes aye. Mr. Cannon? Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Pence? Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes no. Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Feeney? Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Davis votes aye.
Mr. Delahunt?
Mr. Delahunt votes aye.
Are there any other members that wish to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 21 members voted aye, 10 members voted nay.
The bill is reported favorably to the House, and without objection, the bill will be reported favorably to the House in the form of a single amendment. And without objection, the staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes. All members will have 2 days to submit additional views. That concludes the business of the committee for today. We thank you for your kind attendance, and the committee is hereby adjourned.